You're listening to a Countout Podcast. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Ballot, the podcast where the conversation begins. I'm your host, Ryan Knightsey. Of course, thank you very much for listening to this month's episode of The Ballot, where we discuss the criteria or the cases for various wrestlers in the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. Today, I think we have a very fun, very interesting conversation in store for us today, all about Mercedes Mone. Did I meant to do that as a rhyme? 100%. I'm going to go with it. AKA Sasha Banks, of course. And with us today to discuss that is not just me, but of course a fellow social media superstar on the wrestling social medias, a writer from various websites, including Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and so much. In fact, I believe I forgot to tell our guests when this episode's coming out. July. It's coming out the Wednesday before All In Texas, by the way. In April, they also wrote an article all about Mercedes Mone titled Mercedes Mone is on Wrestling's Renaissance World Tour. Lyric, thank you for joining us on The Ballot.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Did you enjoy that level of professionalism where I forgot to tell you that this is not coming out immediately?
No, I mean, I didn't really it really varies. I've been on podcasts. Sometimes people are like, yeah, I record my episodes like 2 months in advance. I've been on podcasts where some people are like, yeah, this is going live tomorrow. So I didn't really stress it too bad.
Perfect. I will say this morning, this episode is going to be scheduled in August. And my co-host, my other podcast said, why don't you just, who's in the July spot? I was like, oh, FTR. And they're like, why don't you just do Mercedes Mone? It feels like that will be important to discuss her before All In Texas, because All In Texas will probably be a pretty big event for Mercedes Mone, at least where we're sitting in June 1st. So very important that this comes out, I think, beforehand. But again, thank you very much for coming on to the show, Lyric. I think we have a great podcast in store talking Mercedes Mone. So I think we'll get into it. A question I ask all of our guests is, what is your connection with Mercedes Mone?
Wow, that is such an interesting question that I have been prepared for my entire life.
Everything in your life has led to this moment. Can you believe it?
No, serious. Well, you know what? It's, believe it or not, it's actually really serious like that. So I have been watching wrestling since October 9th, 2006. I remember it to the date. And I loved it from the moment I saw it. But it was somewhere around middle school and high school, where obviously you notice that other kids just aren't into it anymore. And it's part of it's not even just wanting to be cool, but bro, WWE was can I curse on here?
Yeah, sure.
Oh yeah, WWE was dog shit, right? Getting to a while. There's really no alternative. I unfortunately wasn't really tapped in with Ring of Honor and New Japan back then. And then TNA was on his 14th network.
Of course.
It was just really hard to really stay involved as a wrestling fan.
Sure.
And then when I was in high school, because at that point I had already changed up what I wanted to be growing up so many times. So in middle school, I said I was going to go to law school. I was going to be a lawyer. I was doing mock trial. And then I was okay, I joined a band. And I'd already been doing a course. I was okay, I'm going to be a music teacher. So I'm going to be a music education major, all this stuff. And so I've just changed what I'm going to be when I grow up a million times. And then Black and Gold NXT starts. And I remember seeing Sasha Banks and I was whoa, this is incredible. She's incredible. I was so drawn to her. One, from a representation standpoint, I think of her being a Black woman and just just being all about wrestling, just the wrestling part of wrestling at that time was just so profound and unprecedented for me outside of maybe like Awesome Kong when I saw her in like TNA growing up. But then like all these big matches start happening with 4 horsewomen and like I'm like legitimately like obsessed. Like it was crazy. Like to this day, very few people have provoked those levels of reactions out of me of just like, you do what you do so well that I have to stop everything what I'm doing in my life to go see you do it, or like to like witness you do it. Like Mercedes, Kenny Omega, Beyonce, Audra McDonald. Like that's like the list. Barbara Streisand. That's the list.
Your Mount Rushmore.
Exactly, right? And I got my first job when I was a junior. Was it my junior year? No, I was a senior in high school. So I graduated, that was 2015. Got my first job. I was working at a grocery store and we used to get paid every week. I didn't have a bank account. I used to take like my cash, go to Walmart, buy the 3-month WWE Network gift cards because NXT was solely on the network back then. Just so I wasn't even watching the main roster anymore. Like, and then like Brooklyn happens and Respect happens, and like I tell everybody in my life, like, and I just want to like put this in perspective of like at this point I was like tied for number 1 in my class at that point. I ended up finishing at number 2. I was in National Honor Society. Like I'm at the top of the class. Everybody knows I'm going to college. Like so many people think like, oh my gosh, she's going to be a doctor. She's going to be a lawyer. She's going to be this, that, and the third. I say, I'm going to school and I'm going to major in sport management, sport entertainment management. Nobody was happy. Nobody was happy. But I say this it was a lot of things happening at that time. So like we had the women's revolution happening, you know, in WWE. And then also like I'm from South Carolina with our lovely, amazing Gamecock women's basketball team. So like that was when Dawn Staley, like, I'm not going to say she had just started, but like the program was really getting in that champion mode because they ended up actually winning the national championship that following year. And so women's soccer was booming, like, and I just was like, okay, like women's sports I want to be a part of like this revolution. But wrestling was the catalyst of it, which was specifically Mercedes at the time, like, and that really dictated, like, you know, basically where I thought I was going. So like I ended up getting my degree in sport entertainment management, but at the University of South Carolina, I didn't stick with wrestling because at that time, like there weren't really a lot of options. I graduated in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. So AEW starts around in 2019. But by then I've already like said that I'm not changing my major because I'm going to graduate on time, but I'm doing other stuff. So like I basically like went on a completely different path, kind of gave up on wrestling. And never gave it a real shot, even though that was the real reason, like, you know, why I chose that major. And so when we get to 2023, I had really gotten back into wrestling full throttle by then and then now I'm into mostly AEW, getting into Japanese wrestling and stuff like that. But when Mercedes entered the Tokyo Dome, like when she debuted in the Tokyo Dome, like I feel like everything changed. Like of just, okay, maybe I can do this. Like I was just like, maybe I can do this. So like I start writing that like a couple months after that, and start my podcast 2 months later after her Tokyo Dome debut. And I start specializing, obviously, in alternative international wrestling, particularly like, you know, Joshu, Puro, AEW, all these international. And it was really because I feel like Mercedes opened that door into like those different spaces, particularly I think for Black women to be in those spaces. Like by the end of that year, I was in the Tokyo Dome, like literally, like myself, like it really was like that. So like she's been one of like, I would say one of the guiding figures of like my personal wrestling journey of like making things feel possible, for me to be able to even be in this space, even from like a writer standpoint. I don't wrestle, obviously, but she like really opened a lot of doors for possibilities to say like, okay, this could be something like, and from when I was a teenager, I'm 27 now. So like, I was like, 16, 17 when I saw her for the first time. So yeah, that's my Mercedes Mone story.
That's so lovely. I love this sort of like this, like, we're going to have conversations about obviously Mercedes Mone and these sort of pioneer sort of things about her, the pioneer-esque things about her, let's say. It obviously, but I like that so specifically to you, she was a pioneer in like your like enjoyment almost of wrestling. Obviously she wasn't around in 2006, but by getting into the NXT, like that reinvigoration, then getting into like global wrestling on that scale through her as well. That's so lovely to hear. I love to hear that. I'm so happy you're on this episode because that's
thank you. I'm happy to be on it. Truly,
you're the perfect person to discuss it because she is the sort of forbidden door for your wrestling viewing experience or wrestling fandom experience.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. I'm very happy to hear that. So let's get into her case. Let's get into the nuts and bolts of her Hall of Fame case for the Wrestling Observer newsletter. For those that don't know, of course, the criteria for entry into the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame is, quote, a combination of drawing power, being a great in-ring performer, or excelling in one's field in pro wrestling, as well as having historical significance in a positive manner. Candidates should have something to offer in all three of the categories mentioned, or be so outstanding in one or two of that they deserve inclusion. For Mercedes Mone, there are a lot of places to start, but I feel like the best place to start for us might just be the working ability, because yes. I think it's fair to say it's very strong. If you haven't listened to a previous episode, Lyric, and I hope you have, I like to do a lot of research. I'm a big old nerd. I'm a big old numbers guy. I got Google Sheets for days. It's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But so I went through, obviously I have my own personal preference. I think she's a great wrestler. But I also went through cage match Meltzer ratings and all these sort of things to see if I can find any data to back that up. And of the past 10 years, she has 21 matches rated 8 or higher on Cage Match. Compared to other horsewomen, because I think that is an apt comparison, just for...
I think it's important. Yeah, it's important.
Becky Lynch, the past 10 years, 9 matches rated 8 or higher. Charlotte Flair, 10. Bayley, 5, which was shockingly low to my opinion. Not my opinion, but shockingly low for my expectation. And then I also just added some Joshi comps for also a comparison as well. Io Shirai, 24 in the past 10 years. Mayu Iwatani, 46 in the past 10 years, which was insane. And then Meltzer has similar things. 19 matches rated 4 or higher by Meltzer in the past 10 years, where Becky Lynch has 13, Flair 11, Bayley 6, Io Shirai 14, Mayu Iwatani 13. So what I'm trying to get at here, Lyric, to open up the conversation is, I think there is an argument that of the past 10 years, Mercedes Mone might be the best American, I'll add that qualifier on here, American women's wrestler of the past 10 years. Do you feel like that is a fair thing to say?
Not only do I think, I know. Mercedes Mone.
That's a tee up right there.
Mercedes Mone is, and here's the thing. I think like when we get into like greatest all time, but I can say for a fact, she is the greatest North American women's wrestler of all time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't nobody compares. Like there's nobody that was born in this continent that is comparable all time, like from from career beginning to present. Mm-hmm. There's no one, especially if we're looking from an in-ring standpoint, there's no one. Like there's genuinely no one. And she's the only woman who has the accolades to be even comparable to Japan's best.
Yeah.
And she's the only person who even comes close.
That's why it's so important for me to bring up Io Shirai and Mayu.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
especially
those are contemporaries. Those are, I have a list of women who I believe are the greats of our time, like our greats. I think Mercedes on that list, Mayu, Io, Sari, Athena, Tony, Bianca. I think Chris and Willow are up there. I truly do.
Yeah. Especially like if you go in that past 5 years or so,
absolutely,
there's a good portion of people there.
And I think that's pretty much. Of course, you can get more into like some of the others, like like Shihiro Hashimoto.
Sure, I love Big Hashi. I love Big Hashi.
But I think those are the people that when I look at like the Shuri, yeah, absolutely. Those are the people that I look at of saying like, okay, if I had to pick 10 women who I think are the defining wrestlers, like in-ring wrestlers of our generation, those are it. And Mercedes at the top of that list.
Yeah.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think something that she has that I know for a fact no other woman has is consistency over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. You can point directly to 2015 and see what she was doing. Mm-hmm. You can point to 2020 and see what she was doing. And you can point to 2020, 25. Like you can do these 5-year markers of, and I don't think you can do that with other women, like, especially in North America, like of saying like she was the best wrestler and one of the, like the best in 2015. She was the best in 2020 and she's the best now, which I think speaks volumes to the career that she's had. And as the youngest of the horsewomen, she's only 33?
I think so.
Yeah, she's 33. Her career is nowhere near over. You have at least probably anywhere between 7 to 10 years left at a prime level, she's been injured several times, has returned just as good, if not a better wrestler, even post-injury, and quality of opponents of no other, and that's something that I know for a fact no other woman has, but from North America, to say that she has wrestled the greats of her generation, both in WWE, in AEW, in Japan. She has wrestled everybody, like she's wrestled everybody. We're not even bringing in finishes of like who won and who lost, of just like the matches that she was able to have. Were they slowing down? Were they diluting like the style? Like, did she rise up to meet what they were doing? Of just like, those are important questions to ask. And in each of them, the answer is she was able to adapt to the best wrestling in the world, which is Jiu-Jitsu wrestling. She's been able to have success in numerous areas. And so, yeah, greatest North American woman of all time.
I love it. I think it's completely fair. And I brought it down to the 10 years, but I think it's completely fair to say that in North America, I mean, for several decades, I'm not a full-on expert in women's wrestling and like the June Byers, Mildred Burke days per se, right? And that's also like, how do I compare between that and modern day wrestling?
Completely different.
It's a completely different world. It's impossible to compare. But it is fair. It is so accurate that, that is part of the case. Obviously, a big reason that is allowed to exist is because women's wrestling was so, to use a word you used earlier, Lyric, dog shit during the 90s and the 2000s. But it opened, it sort of allowed and opened the door. That didn't allow it. Mercedes allowed herself to be a great wrestler. What am I saying? She brought it out of herself. I really enjoy her work in ring. I think, yes, I think there is like this weird, the thing that like weirdly works really well with Mone. You saw that a lot in like that Charlotte Flair feud in 2016. Like this like weird element of, to use it negatively would say like sloppiness to a degree, but the sort of
I get what you're saying. Yeah, I think
the ragdollness of Mercedes Mone, there's something about that works really well with her.
But all the greats have had it, right? I think it's so funny because I saw like there was some discourse a couple months ago when people were talking about people who don't know what they're talking about, by the way, but people who were saying how Manami Toyota was such a sloppy wrestler. Like, you know,
an insane statement to make.
It is crazy, right? But I think we have to use, and I haven't figured out a word yet to better say it, but there is a level of just go for broke. I don't care if I live or die type of level to those Manami Toyota matches. And it's a desperation. It's a level of desperation. That's it. It's a level of desperation, right? Of being willing to throw everything at the wall, hope it sticks. Like, you know, whether the landings might be wacky and it might be like, you know, but it's a level of desperation and hunger that is customary to the Joshi style, of course, but particularly in North American wrestling. And I remember those early days, especially once Mercedes got up to the main roster. People are like, oh my gosh, she's always landing on her neck and she's doing like, this is so crazy. And I get like and it really all came full circle for me a couple of months ago when she wrestled Billy Starks. And I still think that's Mercedes' best TV match outside of obviously the Athena match now, but it was so quote unquote sloppy, but it's also like Billy Starks has that same energy, right? Of just that if we die, we die. Like, you know, like this is for the love of the game. Like, you know, I don't care about my neck. I don't care about this. I don't care about that. Like, and seeing Mercedes wrestle her put so much in perspective because she was that for, you know, like for me. And here's the thing, Mercedes is not a great athlete. And like I think like we can be honest about that. She's not the most naturally athletic. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't think she's from a physical standpoint, she's not naturally gifted.
Yeah. For a previous episode we discussed.
Correct.
I think Io Shirai is like a natural performer.
Yes, absolutely. And even comparing to like her fellow horsewomen, Charlotte's the athlete, right? Charlotte was always the athlete. But Mercedes, and I even look at it kind of like with the Shield comparisons, like Mox is a terrible athlete, right? Like he genuinely no flexibility, clumsy, all those things. But I genuinely believe he always just wanted it more than everybody else. And also too, his IQ was so high that set him apart as a wrestler. Yeah. Even though I have problems with like the Death Riders now, but like overall, Mox is one of my favorite wrestlers ever. But he's also one of those people to where he was never naturally gifted like as an athlete, right? But he's always been able to rise to the occasion against just about anybody, especially in those big scenarios. And Mercedes is exactly the same way, you know, like, and I think when you watch somebody's career play out like that, like, you know, for both of them, it makes you realize that that's what makes them better than everybody else, of just the fact that, because I feel like some wrestlers, because they are naturally gifted, they'll rest on their laurels. And then like we saw that to an extent with Charlotte, right? At certain points of her career, even though she is my second favorite horsewoman. But these people who, even if they lack the natural gifts, they have to work harder to overcompensate in other areas. And we've seen Mercedes continues to do that over and over and over again. She knows her limitations in the ring. And I think that's also why, especially like this second part of her career, the second chapter has been so interesting, is because it's her acknowledging her weaknesses and going out of her way to learn more. And do more and add more. Like even too, like look at her body composition right now. She's muscular in places she's never been muscular, right? Like her arms are like super muscular now. She's become a powerhouse. She's realized like, okay, like these are places that where have I been lacking in the past? How do I constantly fine tune my game in all these different areas? Which, like I said, where she lacks in natural ability, she's always made up for it in hard work.
And I think there's almost like, going back to the ragdolliness sort of thing, especially in our early days, it brings like a level of realness to a certain degree.
Absolutely.
Like when I think of those like Charlotte Flair stuff, yeah, there's elements where it's like, okay, that looks super sloppy. But there's also elements, like you said, of holy crap, she's landing on her neck, she's gonna die, which brings the realness to it. I mean, there's countless wrestlers that we call Hall of Fame wrestlers, like Kota Ibushi, Naito, the guys that are great guys that can follow those necks. Now, do I know for a fact that back in 2016 Banks was doing that on purpose? I don't know. I mean, I can tell you for a fact that Kota Ibushi was landing on his neck on purpose. But I can't say that for certain. But I think at the very least, it adds a sort of realism to her game that we're sort of speaking to.
Absolutely. I think her hunger back then was so palpable. Like, I think of just, you could tell how bad she wanted it, and I think that's one of those things that people have never been able to take from her. Of, you could tell with every performance how bad she wanted to be successful. And I think that her matches, that type of level of hunger and determination really brought the sport back into, I think, American women's wrestling at that time. Like, I think of the actual sport. Like, this feels like a sporting contest, right? This feels like a battle of wills. This feels like it just genuinely felt like sport, in a way, more sport than entertainment. That's what I'm looking for there. And I don't know, and we'll probably get into this later, but I think at that time, even when you look at her contemporaries, if you think that any of them are Hall of Famers off of their in-ring, remove her from the equation and ask yourself if you can still think that. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's also the thing with Mercedes too, of just like, I think with every other horsewoman, you need they need each other to like make their case, right?
Yeah.
Just Charlotte doesn't get here without anybody else. Becky doesn't get here without anyone else. Bayley doesn't get here without anyone else. Mercedes, I think, still has a campaign, even if you remove everybody else from that equation,
And I think that campaign is like, we're certainly in the midst of that campaign.
1,000%. This is her legacy run. This is for her legacy. Which,
I mean, obviously, we get to that, I think, more when it comes to like historical significance and all in drawing, certainly. That idea of like, there is like a 2-chapter thing. Is she, if let's say after that WWE run and she never doesn't go back or never wrestles again, is she a Hall of Fame wrestler? I think she has a case to be on the ballot. I don't know if she has enough to get into the Hall of Fame, but the second half is really about what you said. It is establishing that legacy, establishing more so, I think, as time goes on, that case to be a Hall of Fame wrestler.
I think even if she didn't go in this round, I think she was a Hall of Famer strictly off of, I mean, I'm not even going to say I don't want to say novelty,
sure,
but of just, off the historical significance alone.
Yeah.
Like of just like historic significance. If you think about the most defining moments for North American women's wrestling from the last 10 years, she's involved in just about all of them. First Iron Woman match. First, what was she did she do the first Hell in the Cell match? Or was that Charlotte? I know she did one of them. First pay-per-view main event?
Yeah.
First match for the women's championship at WrestleMania.
Mm-hmm.
First Black woman to wrestle main event WrestleMania.
Mm-hmm.
NXT Brooklyn alone, the sagas, the careers that were started because of that match.
Oh yeah. We'll definitely unpack that for historical significance.
Absolutely. I think that she's one of those people. She's kind of like Kobe in the sense of when you think about like when after Kobe died, there was a debate of like, which jersey do you retire, 8 or 24?
Yeah.
But guess what? Both of them have such incredible legacies of just like, and that's how I feel like right now about Sasha Banks and Mercedes Mone.
One other thing I wanted to say about her work is I think I got to bring it up. There are definitely times where the work isn't quite up to par. That first start of the AEW run got a little choppy at times. So like, and to that degree, like I really went to bat in the Io Shirai episode talking about how I think she is like a true Hall of Fame level worker. Mercedes Moné, I almost want to like put maybe just like one notch below that, like, because I almost think like Io Shirai is almost like the best women's wrestler, whereas Mercedes Moné is like the best North American women's wrestler. You know what I mean?
I think that's understandable. Of just Io, like I think
really it's Io.
Io is like, to be able to replicate the success that she's been able to have just about everywhere. Primarily foreign speaking wrestler to reach the heights that she's been able to reach is just a testament to like who she is. I mean, especially at some place like WWE now, of where that's just such a rarity, and she's done everything like there is to do, like the way she did at Stardom, like even like too, like when she swung back around, did the match in Marigold, and it's like no time has passed and she can still work the style, like,
Yeah.
And I think also too, like we have to think like there are gaps in Mercedes's career too. So like there are gaps, like there's like, a year here, months here, like, there are gaps. Io, like from a consistency standpoint, hasn't really had any long-term injuries. She did have that gap where we kind of like didn't know what was going on coming out of COVID. But so I can understand that. But I mean, like we said before, like, like for the most part, as North America goes, like Mercedes is still like easily, locked up. And I think even too, like with like the beginning of her AEW run, I know like people don't like to do this, but I think she does have to be given grace in the standpoint of came back from what could have been a career-ending injury.
Yeah,
even so, her first match back was excellent. Like, her first match back was excellent, and I think that, and I'm not saying that it wasn't all on her because like she wasn't at fault because like, for example, like the finisher, I like, the moneymaker, this, I can admit, like, I was just like, change it. Don't like this for forever. And then like a few other things of like, and also the choice of opponents was a little, after Willow, it got a little,
I talked about this a lot on Ring Post Radio about how this concept that I'm this theory of wrestlers that I'm developing in my brain of, I think there are some wrestlers that I call elevators. A big example, I think, of an elevator, ironically enough, is Will Ospreay. I think it's fair to say that he is a guy that if you could probably put any person in the ring with him, you can put us in the ring with him, and he will elevate us to a phenomenal match.
Yes.
It is just unbelievable. I think Kenny Omega is in the same boat. I think there's a good amount of people that are like true elevators that can really bring anyone up to that bit. Shout out Kenny Omega, Alan Angels.
Kenny Omega, like my goat.
I was thinking about that with Mercedes, and I don't necessarily think that she's a true elevator. I think she has aspects of it, and I was trying to think of like what she might be more qualified of. And the term I invented.
You don't think she is?
Well, hear me out. The term I invented is I'm going to use, this is the proprietary knowledge that I'm putting together, Lyric, and this is a Shark Tank-esque quality where I'm going to present this to you and you can buy in to the company. The term I want to use for her is a multiplier. I think that like if you put her with the right opponent, she will multiply the quality of that match significantly. You can see that with she's with a lot of great opponents, obviously, but Willow, stacked, Stephanie Vaquera as well. These are all still great women's wrestlers, but you know what I mean? With the right opponent, she elevates these matches into like somewhat classics, right? In terms of this past level. I think there are elements that we sort of talked about that post first debut in AEW where she's wrestling weaker wrestlers, weaker opponents, where those matches, they're not necessarily becoming like great matches. They're not getting there. Absolutely. Because she can't multiply something that's lower, which I guess she does. But you know what I'm trying to say.
Also too, she was at a point, at least in those I think especially in those early months, right?
Sure.
She's trying to get her own self back into like prime ring shape.
Yeah.
You know, and so like I think there was also too, and I think I've seen some fans say this, and I agree. There was clearly a point where like you could see that she was timid, like she was wrestling like she didn't want to get hurt. You know, that definitely felt like she was wrestling like she didn't want to get hurt, and so like when you are trying to protect yourself and your opponent's a shitter, then at this point, you know, you get what you get. Yeah, I think I do agree with what you're saying about like her being a multiplier, but I do think she's an elevator because I even look at like this year, like she gave Indy Hartwell a great match. Like, you know, like she had a good match with like Anna Jay and like and a whole bunch of other people who aren't as experienced, is because I think like she kind of like had to like get a grasp of herself again. Yeah. However, what I will say is that I think that Mercedes is at the first time in her career where she doesn't have to be the savior of a division. You know, yeah. I think there was a lot of times, like even for the most part, even WWE's best wrestlers at the time that she was put in front of, for the most part, she was still comfortably ahead of most of them. Mm-hmm. I think, and the only exceptions were probably the Joshi talent. We're probably the Joshi talent. Like there's still people who they like, even if they were good, even somebody like Bianca Belair, who I absolutely love. At that time, Bianca was even still nowhere near the wrestler that she ends up becoming. You know, when they wrestled, like, you know, at WrestleMania. And amongst the horsewomen, Mercedes was always the best wrestler of the four. And then, you know, like the Ronda Rousey stuff happened. And like, so it's just a whole bunch of other things. And I think as far as her ring level, the only people that I think really kind of truly matched her, like who are just as good of a pure wrestler, if not better than her, was probably Asuka and Io, maybe. And you can even tell, like, kind of in her messages now, like AEW, she's like, there's so many stuff I'm able to try and able to do with certain people because, like, it's just a higher, you know, ring level. And I think she's now in a division to where the top stars are, I feel like, are much on a much higher in-ring level. Like Chris Statlander, I think, is an amazing example of, you saw her trying a whole bunch of things she would never try with other opponents because Stat is that dependable of a worker, you know, like you can do so many different things, and the division will not crumble if she doesn't carry everybody, you know, like, you know, it won't fall apart. And I think that frees up a lot of space to be able to give everything that you can give when you do wrestle, when you don't have to stress about what happens when you don't wrestle.
Great wrestler. Bottom period, I guess. Great wrestler. Let's talk about the drawing power. I think it's fair to say that this is probably her weakest case, you know, weakest section of her case, just comparative to the other sections. Because I think I think like historical significance and working rate is a little bit stronger. Just because I think there's two things about her drawing case, in my opinion. Again, I did a bunch of data. I can throw a bunch of numbers out, but I think there's two things about it. One, there is the immediate issue of women's wrestling in terms of the WWE sense, that there is a glass ceiling on any sort of main eventing or semi-main eventing in WWE. I went through all of her WWE pay-per-views that she was on, and I'll tell you, she main evented and semi-main evented 4. And she was in that company for years. And maybe that's, maybe that's like on the higher end for women's wrestlers. It is.
I wouldn't
be shocked if that is the higher end. And That's, has to say something, obviously, about WWE.
Absolutely.
Main evented Hell in a Cell versus Flair in 2016. Semi-main evented Roadblock 2016 versus Flair as well. Main evented, and this is the big part of, I think, a big aspect of her historical significance, but obviously main evented night 1 of WrestleMania with Bianca Belair. Granted, there's the attendance thing of that is the first COVID WrestleMania, but we have to move past the COVID aspect of that. And also semi-main evented Crown Jewel 2021 versus Belair and Lynch. Also sort of, COVID-y numbers. Other than that, Stardom, she was a semi-main event All-Star Grand Queendom in 2020. Just All-Star Queendom in 2023. Best attendance for a Stardom in the history of that company in 2023.
To that point, yeah.
Obviously, 2025, that surpassed it. Main event of that 2023 one, it was Tam Nakano and Julia. I will say there's an aspect of me that almost is like, I'm definitely giving that Stardom thing to Mercedes, but knowing that Nakano becomes this like all-time drawing thing for Stardom, there's a thing with me of like, I'm definitely going to give a lot of that to Nakano as well.
Yeah, you can't, and that's one of those things, you can't give it all to Mercedes of just, I will say, that card for All-Star Grand Queendom was gigantic. Like
loaded.
Himika's retirement match was on that card. You had Mercedes versus Mayu, Tam versus Julia. What else was on there? What was the white belt match? Was that Mina? Was that when Mina won? That was when Mina won the title, I believe.
I want to say yes. I'm pulling it up.
I think that was when Mina won the white belt, if I'm not mistaken.
That was yes, Mina winning the white belt off of Saya Kamatani.
Correct. And so you had a lot of big things happening. Who else? Well, I think Shihiro Hashimoto was on that card
versus Shuri.
So I can't attribute all of Mercedes's of the domestic attendance to Mercedes. What I can say though is that there's a reason, and it's gotten better now, but at that time, Stardom doing English commentary at all was a rarity. There was a reason why English commentary was put on that show, because there were so many people, so many eyes from international viewers that night. And who was it? It was Mariah May actually ended up on commentary for that show. And you had that and the Wrestle Kingdom appearance. And here's the thing, I know, and this also goes back to Juan, Wrestling Observer newsletter, and it wasn't attributed to her, which I always thought was super interesting. And they said, oh, well, because New Japan World subscription spiked heading into Wrestle Kingdom 17. And a lot of it was attributed to Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay. And don't get me wrong, y'all, Kenny Omega, my GOAT, truly. My GOAT. Oh, amazing. However, at that time, let's just be real. Forbidden Door, we were coming off of Forbidden Door from 2022, which was the first Forbidden Door. Super popular, right? And I think like that was the strongest cross section of the New Japan and AEW audience that there had been, I think, at that point. And so I said all this to say of most of the people, the international fans who were going to subscribe to New Japan World for Kenny Omega versus Ospreay had already subscribed. Those last minute ones, and I know it because I saw it in real time on Twitter. I saw Diva stands and stan accounts saying, hey, how do I subscribe for this? How do I do this? How do I do this? Those ones that came, particularly, I would say those 48 hours before the event, because we have to remind ourselves, when was the Omega Ospreay match originally announced? It was at the first historic crossover show. And that was what, October, November, something like that.
Yep.
So people already knew. And I'm not saying, there aren't some last minute folks, but specifically
for enough of us, that level of spike.
Absolutely.
All be last looking people for Ospreay Omega.
And the rumors around Mercedes specifically really started picking up in those last, like basically that week leading up to, you know, Wrestle Kingdom. She had changed her Twitter name from, you know, Sasha Banks WWE to Mercedes Varnado. And so, like, you know, it was a lot of changes. And then those, those hours before the event, she's like, thank you, WWE. Thank you to everybody who gave me opportunities. Thank you, William Regal. Like, it was very much over. And so specifically, I would say those 24 to 48 hours heading into, those are Mercedes. Those are Mercedes. Those are the people who tuned in to see Mercedes. And honestly, we'll probably never have those numbers, but probably if you did a hour by hour count of viewership at that time, you probably noticed a significant drop off after the second match, which is what was Kyrie versus Tam Nakano for the IWGP Women's Championship at the time. I said all that to say, I think that she has just about a better case for drawing power than anybody else. And the reason why I say this is that I actually think it's one of her strong categories, is because she's proven that she could do it outside of the WWE system.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. You know, you can look at also the spike in attendance for AEW with her big business, you know, debut show in a time when AEW is having real struggles on the downward slope for attendance, and
particularly in their bigger arenas. Like she put 10,000 people in the TD Garden.
Yeah, pretty big.
Off a rumor. Off a rumor. Even too, if you want to bring it back to WWE, during the pandemic, SmackDown ratings, she and Bayley were outdrawing Roman Reigns.
Yep. I'm glad you brought this up.
You know, of just like, of course, we can't compare drawing power, you know, from star to star when it comes to women's wrestling sometimes. But if there was ever a person who can, and I think what is even more interesting is because in her career up until now, it's not like she was winning a lot, you know, like we've had anywhere between 30 to 40 day title reigns, and, you know, inconsistent, all of her big matches she lost, you know. She built a fan base that was still so invested, even when her booking was shit. So invested in seeing her and what she was bringing to the table that they never wavered, you know, and she's been able to transpose that fan base across different promotions. And think about, I mean, look at the creation of the IWGP Women's Championship, but specifically the New Japan Strong Women's Championship. Ended up main eventing several of these shows, and people be like, "Oh, these shows aren't always well attended, are always well attended." Listen, outside of AEW and WWE, just about nowhere is going to be doing like monster numbers. Yeah, but
I have all of them in front of me. They're roughly circling the 2,000, 2,500 month. There's one where she made events versus Willa at Resurgence, and that's almost 3,000.
Yes,
but again, nowhere close to like 10 grand, not 10,000 or anything.
But even so, and let's just be real, a lot of some of those outside of Resurgence is kind of like the only like the will, but these other cards, these are not like stacked to the gills cards. It's very clear people are coming for her.
No,
for a woman to be pulling those type of numbers for a non-WWE or AEW show is impressive in and of itself. You know, a crowd going into this knowing, or at least being hopeful, that women will be main eventing this show. Nobody's doing that.
For context, Battle in the Valley 2023 versus Kyrie, she was a semi-main event for attendance of 2152. Resurgence 2023 versus Willow, main event 2903. Capital Collision 2024 versus Momo Watanabe in the main event 1942. Talk about not a stacked card. That I remember the semi-main event was Leo Rush versus Gabe Kidd for the New Japan Strong title. That was a sneaky poo-poo one right there. New Japan Strong Style Evolved 2024 versus Hazuki 2,435. New Japan Resurgence 2025 versus Azumi and Shirakawa 2027. not the year, the attendance number there. So yeah, and that weirdly enough, by the way, I think like the only promotion in terms of like a pay-per-view big time event thing, the only promotion where she gets regularly put into main events and semi-main events, obviously WWE that we talked about that she's never main evented or semi-main evented a AEW show, which I saw that and I was like, really? That really shocks me. But she opens a lot of pay-per-views for AEW.
Well, no, she's only ever opened one. She's only ever opened one.
It feels like it's more.
Feels like it, right? But I think typically she's even said this that if she's not going to main event a show, she'd prefer like to wrestle early. So she'll typically get like the second match or the third match on card. So that's why people genuinely like, oh, like has she ever opened a show? When you get into drawing power, and I think also too, when you look at the base, right? What is her base? Mm-hmm. Who are her fans? The diversity of the type of fans that she is bringing in, and the willingness that they have had to expand their own horizons and try new wrestling, things that were out of their comfort zone that they weren't that they weren't originally familiar with. When you think about drawing power, I think Mercedes's argument is so different from everybody else's, because you get to say, like, when you look at these wrestling fans who might have grown up specifically in an era, a post WCW era, right? Got into this probably before AEW was even a thing. So many of these people had no idea that other wrestling existed. And now these are regular Stardom subscribers. These are regular New Japan World subscribers. Like these are regular AEW watchers. How many people, and we'll probably never have like those numbers definitively, but she opened conversations. And so like, how many people are watching non-WWE wrestling now because of Mercedes Mone? And those, I think when you talk about drawing power, I think that has to be a part of the conversation. And I'm not sure if anybody else can provoke those type of conversations.
I think the only other person in terms of, at the very least on a women's scale, not the only other woman, but one of the bigger names on the ballot in terms of women is Becky Lynch. Because I think a big part of it is obviously 2019, 2018, I forget what year it was off the top of my head. But one of those years, she was the star of WWE for an entire year. And we're going to talk about it more, obviously, but that glass ceiling for someone to be that big of that big of a star, but the big star for WWE is massive. And a lot of that has to do with, like I said, Mercedes Mone in WWE was never really put in positions on a main event, semi-main event to really showcase, hey, is there fruit in the vine sort of thing in terms of drawing whatnot, because she was only on 4 shows in the years of this company. Becky Lynch was on way more, and she became the big star of the company. That part of me wonders, and obviously this is a hypothetical, but how much bigger or how much more of a drawing could perhaps have been if Mercedes Mone, Sasha Banks at the time, was on more of those main events, semi-main events. That's hypothetical. We don't know. We have to stick with what we do know. And that is that Becky Lynch was a big time draw for WWE. And I think that's the only really person we can compare her to.
Absolutely. And I think also too, I still think that Mercedes is in a league of her own in a way, even if you don't think it's particularly better, but I do think that she is very singular in the aspect of she was able to replicate that success in multiple places, I think it's kind of like the Rhea Ripley conversation of just like, is she, and like the popularity is like not up for debate, but also the brand itself is more popular than it ever been. So like with like, what this, does she have the power here? Like it is the power within her, is the power being the face of the brand, or is the power being you? Yeah. And I think that although Mercedes was never the face of the WWE brand, she was a very huge part of it.
Agreed.
And being able to replicate that success in so many places, I think, and even too, and this isn't directly tied to wrestling, but I would say even in her outside of wrestling, the things that she's been able to do as far as appearances and being on talk shows, and I think Hot Ones was a good example, being able to retain all of the assets that she was afforded by being a member of the WWE roster, but being able to book them in her own personal capacity, I think is proof of just truly how big she is as a singular entity. And very few people have that outside of the WWE umbrella, particularly since she changed her name. I think that's a huge part of it. Branding is power, and intellectual property, name, image, likeness is obviously power. Of being able to command that level of success without having the Sasha Banks name. Yeah. She opened so many different conversations that like I don't think like anybody else has ever put themselves in a position to have. And I think that like I think the brand identity and like that name part makes her even more successful of just, of being able to completely transform, completely transform and stay successful.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm glad you also brought up the TV aspect of things, because I think, where we can have this conversation in terms of like pay-per-views and attendance and all these sort of things, I think it's like undeniable that she is a TV draw, a TV star. I mean, we're recording this on June 1st, so what, a month and a half or so before this episode's coming out. The Dynamite, where it's the closing segment with Toni Storm and Mercedes Moné. Obviously, by the time it comes out, we'll see if it was just a one-off thing or a trend. But that having a massive increase in that main event promo segment, let's say, between Toni Storm and Mercedes Moné, that speaks to something, and that is seen as well. Not just in attendance for that big business show, but rating wise as well, for Mercedes Moné. She is a TV draw. You already brought it up, where she was out TV eyes, ratings, or whatever, seen Roman Reigns, who is obviously already in the Hall of Fame. So she is a massive TV draw. That's undeniable. That's, I think, is a big aspect of things. I think just because of the lack of, I guess you could say opportunity, there's some level of spottiness just because, but I definitely do agree that there are definitely times where she'll pop up on a show and numbers go up. First, what was it? That first Battle in the Valley. What was that first one of Kyrie?
Battle in the Valley 23.
Where she got announced and the attendance, I think it sold out, or at the very least, it like the tickets flew off the shelf when that match got announced. And the main event was Okada versus Tanahashi.
No, not Okada versus Ospreay. Was it? No, it was Okada versus Tanahashi. You're right.
Yes, Okada versus Ospreay was 2024.
Yeah, you're right.
But that one, I think that one was meant to be billed as like their last US something match, I think.
They're so unserious.
But still, like that, like there are definite moments throughout Mercedes Moné's career where she gets announced for something and tickets fly, or at the very least subscriptions go, or TV ratings go up. There is, are we going to say that like she goes to New Japan and then suddenly they have 10,000 seat arenas with her? No, she's not, she's not a massive level Hall of Famer in that case, but there's definitely something there in her case, I think.
Absolutely. I think even when she went to Japan, she even had, I remember she had to put like tweets out of like, people, please stay, don't come to my hotels and stuff like that. And I mean, like, it was in the newspaper, not just Shoe Pro, like not just in the Weekly Pro Wrestling when she made her debut at the Tokyo Dome. It was in the local newspapers, like, it's very few people who honestly can, like, I mean, think about it. Wrestle Kingdom, well, who knows? Like, who can put 10,000 seats in an arena post-COVID? Like, I think, or at least fill out the dome, right? Like that's Japanese wrestling attendance numbers or something that keeps me up at night. Anyway, but I think we're not going to sit here act like she's not no scrub, because here's exactly, and this is why I can say this too. There have been several people who have left WWE in years since, when they tried or even went out to Japan, they were not commanding those type of numbers.
Mm-hmm. Give me those receipts. Give me those receipts.
Like, do you think Nick Nemeth was getting those type of numbers? No. Mercedes going to Japan when she did, genuinely, I feel like it snapped the timeline of everything interesting that has happened in international women's wrestling since can be directly tied to that moment. Mm-hmm. Look at the New Japan Strong Women's Championship tournament on Resurgence, right? Single-handedly changed the course of wrestling as we know it. Stephanie Vacker becomes a star that night. Willow Nightingale becomes a star that night. Who does Willow Nightingale end up dropping the New Japan Strong Women's title to? Julia. Who does Julia end up dropping the New Japan Strong Women's Championship to? Stephanie Vacker. Who does Stephanie Vacker end up dropping the New Japan Strong Women's title to? Mercedes Mone. That match gets Stephanie Vacker signed. Mm-hmm. We have so many different people who have been affected, or even too, Momo Watanabe becoming such a big deal in the States. That starts with that Capital Collision match that it felt like nobody was at. And then she ends up getting booked on AEW and then she's in like the Forbidden Door pre-show and then ends up wrestling Mercedes again. Yep. Hazuki now has the type of motion of wrestling Mercedes. And I think a lot of people, including me, have been wanting her go on a freelance run for a long time. Now she isn't in the States. Mina Shirakawa, meeting Mercedes, talks about how like that completely changed the trajectory of her own career, going to wrestling her in the Tokyo Dome, singles match, ended up going to wrestling for the New Japan Strong Women's Championship, 3-way, signs with AEW. All these things are connected, this web. And it all goes back to Mercedes becoming a free agent. Even I would say, look at somebody like Mariah May, right? Goes to Stardom at the perfect time, 9-month run, mm-hmm. Goes to AEW, ends up in WWE. Like, there's so many different, there's so many people who were inspired by that, right? I'm not saying that people never went to Japan before after that.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that people were not going to Japan before that. But there was a clear emphasis on from an international capacity for women, of seeing that as an opportunity to get opportunities that they weren't getting in the States. Mm-hmm. I think Mina Shirakawa was a good example. Toni Storm, right? When she ended up reviving, changing her entire character, Amnesia, where'd she go? She went back to Stardom. She goes to CMLL. She's on a world tour. Athena, trying to put herself, on a map on a global scale. What does she think she needs to do? What does she say she needs to do? A world tour. What is it? International Women's Cup, a 4-way, Tokyo Dome, before the main card of Wrestle Dynasty, where Mina versus Mercedes was happening. You have 4 of the best in the world today. Persephone from CMLL, Willow from AEW, Athena from Ring of Honor, Momo from Stardom. The catalyst. She's the catalyst, of professional wrestling. And also, too, look at WWE in comparison. And where has the women's division gone since she's been gone?
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah.
She was that high level worker, to where you can guarantee at least 2 to 3 times, 4 times a year, there will be anywhere between a 4.5 to 5-star match guaranteed every year while she's on the roster. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that great matches aren't happening, but they are more of a rarity. They are more of a rarity in her absence. And think about the women who are thriving. Particularly, they are all a lot of them are stars that she directly had a hand in making.
Mm-hmm. Or I think in the case of, I guess, yes, Io Shirai during the pandemic, she did have a hand in that. But like we said already, it's like Io Shirai, I think she probably would have broken through no matter what. But Mercedes obviously had a hand in that during the pandemic. Bianca Belair, famous example. What was it? Did she have interactions with Ripley? Why do I not remember any of those?
Brief, not defining or anything though.
Yeah,
like not
it's Charlotte
like
Flair really is.
But Charlotte was Rhea's mountain to climb.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. So we're kind of circling it. We've been circling all show. Let's talk about historical significance. I think in, let's say, 20, 25 years, however long it takes, assuming they're still doing it, I think the Sasha Banks versus Bayley Brooklyn match is going to probably be entered into the WWE Hall of Fame greatest matches of all time. They're going to have a bust of half of Banks' face and half of Bayley's face, much like Austin and Bret Hart, because I think it is so abundantly clear that that match is a massively positive, historically significant match in the history of, I mean, obviously women's wrestling, but I think it changes the course of wrestling following that on a grander scale. At the very least with North American wrestling. That is really, and there's a sort of predecessory, Natalia Charlotte Flair one at the first NXT takeover, but it's really Brooklyn. It's Brooklyn. It kicks off the engine of the women's revolution. As much as Stephanie McMahon would like you think that it was her, it really Brooklyn that kicks things off. It ultimately is what leads to this fervor and leads to evolution. One, it leads to it helps increases Becky Lynch, gets us eventually to WrestleMania main events. It starts at Brooklyn really at the end of the day.
I mean, even as in the tag belts, women's tag team wrestling gets introduced in America as a result of that match, which is also, and I think like that legacy right now is being written. Like, I think that legacy, and I think even too, if AEW ends up actually ends up creating these tag belts, that all stems from Sasha Bayley, Brooklyn, which is a whole different level of wrestling that I don't think we've really even tapped into yet in America.
Yeah, it's and I was thinking about it as well in terms of a contrasting idea. You talk about NXT Brooklyn, Takeover Brooklyn, and what that ended up, and I think you could immediately point to that match between the two, and I think the Iron Woman match at Respect afterwards. Is an addition, but obviously it's Brooklyn first. I was thinking about it as well that because I'm prepping also for the other episode regarding spoilers alert, folks, because this isn't spoilers. They're the new people on the ballot. I'm going to talk about it at some point about FTR. I'm working on that episode as well about the FTR thing. And, you have, I think, this peak in sort of WWE tag team wrestling with the Revival and DIY feud. And I think that's a very memorable moment, very memorable rivalry. And I think whereas that escalated tag team wrestling for sure in NXT, it didn't quite translate into the main roster, and it definitely didn't really translate worldwide, because worldwide really is the Young Bucks, obviously, in terms of that elevation. And I think that's where FTR struggles. Comparing and contrasting to Brooklyn, Bayley, and Sasha Banks, that has staying power. That match is historically significant because it has staying power. And I'm just talking about the women's revolution. We're not even discussing the sheer amount of wrestlers that were inspired directly by that match. And I think you already mentioned Billy Starks. We're already
seeing it. We get to see that. But we're seeing it now. And I think the Hall of Fame, that's why I say the Hall of Fame case is truly being written.
Yeah,
because all those people are now grown enough to wrestle.
Yeah,
look at I think about Respect, when Sasha makes this kid cry. The kid's a wrestler now.
Yeah. The kid's a wrestler now.
Look at Roxanne Perez, Billy Starks, people like Carmelo Hayes, Daniel Garcia, who directly talk about how Mercedes influenced their careers. Mm-hmm. So much of the young generation of wrestlers under 30, Willow Nightingale herself, the match that we don't talk about, Britt Baker, of all these people who have been at least the staying like, you know, the stalwarts on television, women's wrestling across WWE and AEW, being like, they will say they were directly influenced by that match. Even when Mercedes went to Japan, they even, like, you know, the reports came out of like how the roster, like, they were just so like, oh my gosh, I want to take pictures with her. I want to see, like, oh my gosh, like, you know, that match literally set vibrations through the entire world that we're still feeling today.
Yeah, agreed.
Indy Hartwell, like, you know, Mercedes even going on the indies, wrestling, you know, Indy, being like Kanji, like all of these different people are people who grew up watching her, like, you know, who grew up watching her, who can directly point to that match of saying like, oh, I wanted to become a wrestler that day. And then there's still so many people who we still have yet to see, right? Who are still developing that we don't even know about, you know, yet. Nobody else has ever done that. And I think that that's one thing where I think that she stands really clear of the other horsewomen, aside from obviously Bayley, in the sense of nobody can deny Becky's drawing power, right? And nobody can deny, like, you know, what Charlotte meant on a big match level. But as far as being able to say like, oh, this one, even when they, and I think what's so interesting about it is that even if they they do have the main events, right? And they did get like more of the big profile matches. When you ask people like, what is the match that really like changed everything? It's still Brooklyn, which didn't even main event that night, you know?
No, it did not. It's semi-main event.
I think Kenny Omega's one of those people. Of so many of Kenny's big matches, believe it or not, they in New Japan, they didn't main event, you know, but it's cultural significance. Like kind of like with the Omega Okada series, several of those matches never main evented, you know, they never main evented, but it's cultural significance and what they meant in the long run to, you know, professional wrestling. And it's just like off that match alone, she's already a Hall of Famer. Then you add in all the other matches.
Yeah, you then add in the main event WrestleMania with Bianca Belair.
Absolutely. I think, and I wasn't even going to say that. I was going to go to the next match. Respect.
Sure.
30 women going 30 minutes in an Iron Man match was unheard of. Mm-hmm. Unheard of. Actually, still kind of unheard of everywhere because we haven't seen it again.
Sadly.
But for the most part, that's unheard of. Think, like, just go back to just when you think through all of these milestones, right? Of just this changes the game. Oh, Bianca versus Mercedes main eventing WrestleMania changes the game. Mm-hmm. Women's tag team championships being created changes the game. Then you get into the second phase of her career, right? I mean, even starting with the Kyrie match, think about how long to wrestle in a historically all-male promotion.
Yes.
Marquee space and the amount of time that she was allotted on the card and special entrances for a place that notably doesn't give a fuck about their production when they're in the U.S. Mm-hmm. I say this as a huge New Japan fan, but like if you've watched New Japan shows in the U.S., you know.
Oh, I know.
And you have that. You have then, you know, she does the three-way wrestling on a mainland New Japan card. Mm-hmm. Sakura Genesis. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, that's in Ryogoku, one of the most famous buildings in Japanese wrestling. Mm-hmm. Period. And defending an IWGP championship. Like, you know, like not the New Japan show, an IWGP championship against Joshi wrestlers who are wrestling at full speed in their home country, and she is wrestling at pace completely. Then you have Mayu Iwatani match, wrestles, you know, I mean, are one of the greatest of all time, you know, in Yokohama Arena, which is even crazy. I think when we look back at that match, we don't know the significance of it yet. Like, of just that really is like the equivalent of like Cena versus Tanahashi. Truly. Like, it's like, you know, we always talk about like it never happened, but like that's really the equivalent of really what that match was. It was too short, of course. Then you get into Resurgence, which changes everything. You know, the tournament itself from top to bottom, all the way to the AEW run and all the milestones she's had. Most people would kill for one of those moments or one of those matches. She's had several. She's had a career full of them.
Yeah. One, I brought it up. One of the big ones, obviously, I think, is main eventing WrestleMania. First ever women's singles main event of WrestleMania. You know, not just historic, obviously, in terms of a women's wrestling sense, but historic in terms of a black wrestler sense. The first main event to ever feature two African American wrestlers in a main event of WrestleMania, biggest stage. That is extremely significant.
Probably any pay-per-view, honestly, that WWE's ever done. If you really think about it, probably any pay-per-view they've ever done.
Which sucks.
We don't have enough time for me to talk about those things.
But that is obviously like that is an very, you know, I think sadly when it comes to WWE, it doesn't have as many ripple effects as I would like it to. It's not like we're getting African American wrestlers in the main events every single year, I guess, you know,
or ever again.
But I think it at the very least is very historically significant, both on a women's wrestling side, but obviously on the African American history of wrestling side. So I think that is incredibly important for obviously Mercedes Moné, but also Bianca Belair.
Changed my life. I love them. Yeah, changed my life. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that there are a lot of the starting points there, and then this sort of second chapter of her career. I think there are beginnings of like historical signifier sort of beats, but it is stuff that is still very much playing out, and it is just like kind of time, you know, not to say that like she's early to be on the ballot, and you know, I don't necessarily think she's going to be like a slam dunk first ballot Hall of Famer, just because that is an incredibly tiny list, and other reasons about women's wrestling that I'm sure we'll get into. But I think that her future, I think she will remain on the ballot. I don't think she's falling off the first thing. But I think she will, by remaining, we will get to see more of her case develop and more of it shine through. And I think that is important. I think she's very strong. And I think in terms of historical significance, it can only get stronger as the years go on.
Yeah, when we like, as far as historical significance, like just even that alone, I think the New Japan piece cannot be understated. Of this was and still is a historically male promotion. Yeah, and bending, even Wrestle Kingdom, right? 13 minutes in the dome on that card. That was a lot. That was a lot. You know, compared to other women, we're getting like 8 if they get booked on the card at all.
I think that Kyrie match where Mercedes Moné debuted was like 5.
Exactly, like 6. It was like 6.
Yeah.
And even Mayu Iwatani the night before, it only got her and Azumi had only got 9 minutes. You know. Yeah. And so it speaks volumes to the type of. And I know, like somebody's like, oh, it's just 13 minutes, but I mean, in that context of just proves the type of power that she has. Yeah. I mean, to get that from what is widely considered to be the harshest, toughest style of wrestling in the world, to command that type of presence as a woman, as a Black woman, as somebody who, I mean, was never WWE's biggest star, you know, was never positioned as the biggest star. Mercedes' legacy is earned, like, you know, as far as earned in the sense of truly most of her critical acclaim and her support, and her not her accomplishments, but the acknowledgement, you know, of her work it really is mostly stems from her in-ring work, you know, to be able to wrestle to inspire a generation. Like, she's not the strongest mic worker. Like, you know, I don't think like it's out of left field to say that.
I don't. Yes.
And we've like, you know, we even talked about like the natural like athletics part of it. So which I think makes her even more dynamic compared to others, just as because she built all this 90% off in-ring work.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at other women, particularly North American women, or not even North American women, non-Japanese women, just bringing in that umbrella. Even somebody as popular as a Becky, even somebody as popular as a Tony, you know, to build that type of legacy for yourself purely, solely, strongly off of in-ring work alone. She's unprecedented.
I think she is. I think it's almost like she purposefully intends to be a historically significant wrestler. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think what she goes out and tries to accomplish is to be historically important. And obviously, you know, being a great draw and being a great worker and all these things are part of that. But like, I think that is her pure intentions, is to go somewhere and change it or alter it or make something, you know, change it in a positive manner as per the criteria. I think that is like what she intends to do and sets out, and that is the goals that she tries to achieve. That I think she, in a large way, has strongly achieved so far. Wherever she goes. And I think like not to say like the sad reality of things, but that is the sort of, when it comes to the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, I think historical significance is sort of not treated as a weaker, but people look at it less because they want to look at the objective truth and facts of drawing, right? They probably go to work rate and all those things because that's easier to look like, especially when it comes to modern US and Canada region. It's really hard to judge some historical significance wrestlers in that candidacy because so many of them are still happening, are still wrestling, right? So I think like with that intention and trying to become a historically significant wrestler, it is something that there's almost another hurdle to jump over, along with the billions of other hurdles that let's say a Black woman in wrestling has to achieve in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame.
Absolutely.
Let's open up the conversation to that aspect of just women's wrestling in general, in terms of the modern sense, for the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame. Very difficult. Obviously, women from Japan get voted in all the time. Women historically get voted in. Modern, there hasn't been a woman in a modern sense in decades, or rather in decades of voting period or whatever, that hasn't been voted in. Obviously, no one from like the Attitude Era, no one from the Ruthless Aggression Era. Obviously, Trish Stratus has been hanging on at 10% for like 6 years or something like that. Charlotte was on the ballot in 2021, fell off immediately. Becky Lynch still holding strong, 25% right now, still very much holding strong. It's just an aspect where women's wrestling, it has more of a hurdle to jump over getting into this Hall of Fame than anyone else. Lyric, let's talk about it. Why do you, just from, I guess, a general sense, why do you think that could be the case?
Well, I mean, women's wrestling in North America is at least decades behind, I mean, Japan anyway. So it's just like, I always say, like, when we did the women's revolution, like back in 2015, that's really chapter one.
Yes.
Like, that's really chapter one of, like, you know, trying to make women's wrestling a serious entity in North America, you know, like, of course, like, shout out to Shimmer, shout out to the knockout division, like, you know, in those early 2000s, but on a large scale, that was chapter one. We are 10 years in, you know, I think women's wrestling became, it's like, and like, to put it in comparison of, and like I'm even going through the Hall of Fame of like what era are the women like who are already on it, where were they from? And aside from like Mildred Burke, like when you look at Japan, things kick off for Japanese women's wrestling in the 70s, which is, hey, Beauty Pair, I think we're probably the last women to go in 2023, right?
Yeah.
So that's where things really kick off in Japan. So if things really kick off in the US in 2015, I think it speaks for itself. Everybody's running from behind. Like,
yes. You're talking about American women's wrestling is on a 50-40 year deficit compared to Joshi.
Correct. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, between misogyny and sexism and the fabulous moolah and Vince and all these. There's so many different reasons for that. But you can't change the past at this point. That we just are where we are.
Yeah. And
I think that the criteria of which we judge women's wrestling has been so dismissive for the longest of. And I think also too, and I think some people have benefited from that, right? Like there are several women who are wrestling right now who have no intentions of being the best wrestler on earth, especially between WWE, and there's even some in AEW too, just are very much so more so into the character of it all. And they see themselves as TV characters, which is totally fine. But I think
totally fine
because of that, when you're already coming from behind historically, it makes it harder to take things seriously. And then think about the time that women are actually being given to have these classic matches, it's only but so much you can do with 5 and 7 minutes. And so, or one match per show, or, the limitations, there are so many limitations around North American women's wrestling. And I think as a whole, and then I also think too of just, I was about to say no shade, but this is going to come off shady regardless, of just Dave is very much so still stuck on 90s All Japan women's wrestling. We're only just, and that's why I'm actually very interested to see what happens this year, just because this is the first year he gave a 5-star to a women's match, to any women's matches, since Shuri versus Utami Hayashishita. Yep. And before that, it was decades?
Yeah.
Before. So even this year has been completely out of left field as far as women's wrestling. The first North American 5-star women's match happened this year.
Yeah.
The second North American 5-star women's match happened this year. There was 3 5-stars in Japan. We got women winning 5 stars for Anarchy in the Arena. And so I do think that it's proof to me that things are, whether people want to admit it or not, things are changing as far as women's wrestling. Of even the harshest critics are being forced to pay attention. And I think that that's kind of where we are now. But even so, that's going to take its consistency is going to be really huge, I think, from these companies. And I think that WWE is already taking their feet off the gas. It looks like AEW is putting their feet on the gas, but that is liable to change at any time.
We're recording this on June 1st. It's released in July.
Yes, I love to say, I say this all the time. No American wrestling company has earned the benefit of the doubt when it comes to women's wrestling. Nobody has been consistent enough for a long enough amount of time. And I think especially, and let's just be honest, in today's political climate of companies actually pushing women's wrestling to the forefront is a statement. And some may want to make that statement, some may not. So yeah, I think it's all of those different things that really kind of affect how women have been historically, I think, platformed in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, but just any Hall of Fame. Look at WWE's Hall of Fame, right? Of just, it's a lot of different moving parts that go into it.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think there is just a lot of difficulty. I fully agree that on the statement that women's wrestling in the United States is so far behind. Like you said, chapter 1, I was thinking it's basically like a reboot. Like we basically are kind of starting over from scratch in a lot of ways. And obviously not to say that Joshi wrestling had some down periods, right? That the 2000s or something. But it's something that is just going to take time. When it comes to like the criteria as well, I think that the criteria of the Hall of Fame, it's something that I think we kind of talked about in regards to like drawing, right? That with women's wrestling, that it is never really been put into situations where you can really prove anything with women's wrestling, because it's never put in those little big slots, which is why I think like Becky Lynch is such a big figure when it comes to drawing, and why almost like her being a top star as a woman adds like to her historical significance case, right? Not just as being a big draw top star in the company for a year. Granted, longevity issue things and all that stuff I'm throwing out the door for right now. But I want to say it was Joe Lanza from Voices of Wrestling in the Sabu episode of the ballot, where he talked about how, generally speaking, really not just in modern US and Canada, but really everywhere at this point, especially like Japan, for instance. A lot of the major drawing stars are all pretty much in. All like the slam dunk Hall of Fame drawing, people are in the Hall of Fame. To a certain degree, I almost think Cody Rhodes has become a slam dunk Hall of Fame drawing case. But
unfortunately, he is.
I'm fairly confident he is getting voted in this year.
He is.
But to that extent, if we have to now, historically, the Hall of Fame voters have really looked at drawing as a big time case because I think it's more objective. We have to look at the other things. How important is historical significance, and how important is wrestling, obviously. I think when it comes to women's wrestlers like Becky Lynch, like Mercedes Moné, as we've just spoken about, being able to break through legit like cement ceilings. I'm not going to say glass, but cement ceilings that is the WWE. It is a massive milestone to achieve as much as they were able to achieve in that system. That was created, not necessarily created, but developed into a system where women's wrestling is just a thing on the show, right? And I think, being able to spread that and be able to prove that it can work in other regions, like we said with Mercedes Moné, showcases more of that historical significance. Yes, she's not like a Hall of Fame level draw, right? But she is. But all of them are pretty much in. She has historical significance. She plans to be a historically significant wrestler, and I think, there is a certain degree where I almost would want to vote in Becky first, just because I think that she became like the peak horsewoman just because of that drawing case, right? But there's a big part of me that's like, I really do like Mercedes Moné's case. I do think there's a big aspect of it where it's still very much developing. But I really like what she's put in so far.
I think you have to ask yourself this question, and it is this. If I took this person out of wrestling history, how much changes?
If Brooklyn never happens.
If Brooklyn never happens, what does wrestling look like? And I can say, here's the thing. Don't get me wrong. And I'm not even saying, and I'm not trying to say either or, because I think, like, honestly, they both have a case.
Yeah.
I think you can remove Becky, and as long as you have the other three, of course, you can remove Becky, and I don't think too much shifts. Like, I think some things obviously are going to change. Like, maybe you don't get that first paper maybe. Oh, all right, no, they'll just do Charlotte versus Ronda, because you have Ronda Rousey, who's that top draw at that time, right? So
and I think they would have preferred. I think they would have preferred Charlotte versus Ronda for some reason.
That was what they really wanted. But you can remove Becky, and not too much changes, at least on the grand scale, right?
Sure.
If you remove the artist formerly known as Sasha Banks, everything changes. Seismic, not just in WWE, But women's wrestling as a whole, of single-handedly one of the most important wrestlers, of even if you don't want to get into greatness. And that's what I always say, like, of just like, Bayley's probably not going to have the stats, but when we get into like the most important wrestlers of the 21st century, she's one of them. And Mercedes is that 10 times over. And I think it's one of those things of the four horsewomen are so interesting because this is the first generation of women main eventers in North American wrestling. And this is the first generation of those, so many people end up coming later, of like the Biancas and the Rhea Ripleys and hell, even the Toni Storms, and then eventually, the Willows and all those people. But this is the first generation of real tried and true main eventers. And even so, like, I think like, obviously they didn't even get the opportunities that like their male peers at the time. And I think that four horsewomen in the Shield are kind of like concurrent in a lot of ways. Like, so no, they didn't get a lot of those opportunities. But as far as they are the first generation, when it comes down to it, you have to look at the drawing conversation very differently, and I hope that the people who vote really factor in the nuance of that conversation when it comes to North American women's wrestling.
Yeah. The fact that women are able to break that barrier adds, absolutely. I think it adds to their historical significance. Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think there is a big issue in terms of how women are perceived, especially women's wrestling is perceived on an American scale. Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. I think that is changing. But I also agree with you that it's changing and it's just been 10 years and it's going to take, it's like, it's sort of in a different, not necessarily a different degree, but it's sort of similar to the conversations we have like regarding AEW, right? It's this sort of thing of like, you kind of have to let like AEW exist for a while because like you can't necessarily compare them to WWE. Because WWE has decades of being a monopoly basically in American wrestling, versus AEW, who's coming in and comparing a decades long company, 40 plus year company, at least with former McMahon, versus AEW, who is at this point a 6-year company. You can't compare it because AEW is still existing. Kind of what we're talking about women's wrestling, it kind of has to exist because it's really been rebooted first chapter for the past 10 years.
I feel like, honestly, we're in the middle of a soft reboot right now. I think like things kind of like really slowed down and cooled off. And I think Mercedes is a part of, Mercedes leaving WWE really issued in that soft reboot. Cause I think like a lot of people had gotten comfortable of just like, okay, like there's a difference between being the first and then like, being the only. And I think we were steadily approaching a path of being the only, of like, those milestones. And that was going to be it forever. Just kind of like same way, like that Trish Lita Raw main event was the pinnacle for like over a decade after that. And I think that there's so many different conversations that need to be had. And I think also too, what's really going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people to really talk about is honestly, where does Vince McMahon really kind of like factor into all of this?
Sure.
As far as like the treatment of women's wrestling and like misogyny, because I think that's also something that Japan wasn't up against, of there are less than 10 years between the first women's pay-per-view main event and the last bra and panties match, like that's not a lot of time in the grand scheme of things of training an audience to look at these wrestlers as basically eye candy versus
the intermission,
Exactly. Like of just, and we're still seeing that training to this day. Like it's the audience trained to be able to see women as, skilled competitors.
Yeah.
And it really stems from that of just like, the Attitude Era all these harmful, like stereotypes and just like, portrayals of women and how they have continued to be passed down and trickle down. And I think also too of everything in wrestling is geared towards men, even down to like the creative team, who's booking women's wrestling, right? Who's writing for women's wrestling, who's writing about women's wrestling, and like the committees that actually vote on these things for like a Hall of Fame level of 9 times out of 10, I'm willing to bet like my bottom dollar on it. I don't have proof of this, but I'm almost positive most of the people who will be voting on this will be men,
yeah.
Yeah. And 9 times out of 10, most of them will be white men at that.
Yeah.
And so it's so many different hurdles that you have to consider that are going to play a very large factor into, I think, like what Hall of Fame worthy will be considered, particularly for a North American women's wrestler. And so there's a lot, like there's just so much that goes into it. And honestly, that's not a long time. Like I'm 27 years old. I started watching wrestling when I was 8 years old. In my lifetime, I've seen 5-minute matches, women's matches. I've seen 1-minute women's matches. I've seen bra and panties matches. Yeah. I've seen Black women main event WrestleMania. I have seen, I've seen blood and guts, like not actual blood and guts match, but like these hardcore things. Like I've seen it all.
Several all women's pay-per-views.
Yeah, several all women's pay-per-views. I've seen women main event pay-per-views. I've seen women be left off of pay-per-views. These constant like ups and downs, and like some of these things are happening a little bit more recent than I would have liked. And I can't sit here and act like that's the thing. Women's wrestling is always going to be an uphill battle every single day. It doesn't matter how big of a star any of these people are. They will still rank lower than the top men in the company. It's always going to be a fight for TV time. It's always going to be a fight for where you are on the pay-per-view card. It's always going to be a fight to be on the damn pay-per-view yourself. Like, how many women will be able to be on a pay-per-view? Like what will you be allowed to do? There will always be some uphill battles to fight that nobody else, at least from a North America context, has to really worry about.
I agree. Well, like we do with everyone on the podcast, I'm gonna now share my screen. What I used to do is I did something else, and I figured out that this is a better system. I'm gonna share my screen. As you can see in front of you, let me see if I can make it any bigger. That did nothing. This is the current ballot as of kind of today of modern US and Canada. This is the ballot. Obviously, Mercedes Mone is going to be in. I hope you can see that. I hope that's easy to read. I added Sabu because it's very likely that he's going to be in. I'll read this out for the folks at home. There's percentages as well. I'm not going to read those. But the people in this category, 17 acts, CM Punk, Cody Rhodes, Mark and Jay Briscoe as a tag team, the Steiner Brothers, Randy Orton, Edge/Adam Copeland, John Moxley, Becky Lynch, Bill Goldberg, Matt and Jeff Hardy, Samoa Joe, The Outsiders, Trish Stratus, Drew McIntyre, FTR, Mercedes Moné, Sabu. Lyric, there's 17 acts. That means you get 5 votes. I'll highlight them as we do it. But who, right now, I'm going to put you on the spot, are your 5 votes? Or up, right? I should say up to 5 votes.
Okay. Mercedes, all right. I'm going to go with Mercedes. I'm going to go with John Moxley. I feel very strongly about that one, too. I'm going to go with Samoa Joe.
Ooh, I love a Samoa Joe shout.
Mark and Jay Briscoe.
Yes. You got one more.
I gotta go with Cody.
Yeah, real struggle there. Why pick those names? You picked Cody, the Briscoes, Moxley, Samoa Joe, and Mercedes. Mercedes is obvious at this point, but why?
Mercedes is obvious. Okay, John Moxley. I think John Moxley is the most important wrestler of of this decade. Since 2019. Yeah. I think 2019 Jon Moxley alone is probably the most important wrestler of the 21st century, of leaving WWE when he did, being a part of AEW, going into the G1 Climax, for New Japan, Catalyst. I mean, he was the forbidden door, of the initial AEW New Japan relationship, being a big part of mending that after obviously the Elite left. Being able, I'm almost positive he was part of being able to bring in Bryan Danielson and a whole bunch of, and I think even the matches of the wrestler that he is, the wrestler, especially, I think his 2019 to 2022, man, he was just about, a dead ringer for best wrestler in the world for a very long time, aside from probably Kenny during that time. And I think also too, that's just his WWE career, but you get into, not WWE, his AEW / New Japan career, where, like I said, hey, he's the global Grand Slam champion, the first ever and the only person to, and it's so funny is because when she wins, Mercedes will be the only person to ever join him to be world champion in New Japan, AEW, and WWE. So it's so funny if she ends up, when she wins the AEW Women's World Championship, she will become the second person to do that. But his WWE career, I think, and to come from the background that he came from in the Indies, working primarily a deathmatch style, in CCW, to adapt to the WWE system, be a part of the Shield, reach the height, Yeah, Mox is probably the biggest no-brainer on this list for me. Mark and Jay Briscoe, I think. But for me, top 5, dead or alive, literally tag team all the time. They did everything. The only thing that they didn't do was TV. I will say, I think that's something that kind of would hurt their campaign in comparison, to some others. But I think from a quality standpoint to an impact standpoint, on their fellow wrestlers, and I think just global dominance. They held championships just about everywhere that they went, both in Japan, in America, all over the world. I think as far as tag team wrestling, modern tag team wrestling, them and the Young Bucks, I know we were talking about compared to FTR, had an impact kind of on NXT at the time. But I think from an international standpoint of really impacting, wrestling, especially outside of the WWE space, the Briscoes are, absolutely monumental. And I think also too, they essentially built Ring of Honor. And Ring of Honor's importance to the wrestling landscape during the time between WCW's end and AEW's beginning was so crucial. And I don't think that they really exist or they don't survive without the Briscoes. Samoa Joe. Listen, I think, and I kind of I teetered back and forth here between should I pick Samoa Joe or Sabu for this. But the reason why I picked Samoa Joe, even though I'm sure Sabu goes in, and I don't dispute that at all. Samoa Joe has not declined. Samoa Joe has never declined. He's kind of like Sting in that regard of, yes, he might be different. He might be a different wrestler, but to be able to produce quality on the level that he was in every single promotion that he touched and still add value. I think he's probably, I think he's AEW's best utility worker. He's been somebody that they've been able to insert in every division. We need the trios division amped up. Got you. We need the world title redone. Got you. We need the TNT championship. Great. He's been able to be this incredible utility worker. He still feels fearsome. he is still like a high level worker. And I think that as far as impact, most of our favorite wrestlers never become who they're meant to be without him.
Yeah.
I think that's why I pick him over somebody like a Punk versus just like the long-term impact. I think on the actual wrestlers of just like, what he may lack in drawing capability of just Samoa Joe's legacy is still actively being written, I think that, I think he's historic. And who's the last one? Cody.
Yeah.
So much of Cody's WWE career makes me scratch my head, at least the second part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up a big Legacy fan, but I think it really speaks for himself. I really genuinely think like it speaks for himself of, he was able to find success in those early days. Still he was able to reach some level of success in those early days of WWE leaves. I mean, the formation of All In and AEW alone. And I think just being able to, the fame that they were able to bring Ring of Honor and New Japan to, at the time. And then afterwards, going to WWE, unfortunately, like on drawing capability, you're not going to be able to fight him. You can't fight him, I think, especially with how hot WWE has been these last couple of years. And he has been a mainstay in their main event picture. I think like he kind of like took the ball and ran. Like I think that in ring he's not as strong as probably the other people on this list, especially the other people that I picked. But as far as historical significance and drawing power, those two categories are probably strong enough. Of like he's also one of the most important wrestlers of the 21st century. If you can't do any of this without Cody Rhodes. He's one person. And if you take him out, and I like to think of it like that, of like if I took these people, if you take this person out, how much changes? Everything changes without Cody. Just like I believe like everything changes without Samoa Joe. Like it's not as, you may not think so. I think, and that's the thing, people might not think so, but take Samoa Joe out of Ring of Honor, take Samoa Joe out of TNA, take Samoa Joe out of NXT when he was in there at that time, take Samoa Joe out of AEW. Each of those companies are significantly worse off, without his presence. And same thing with American Tag Team wrestling for 21st century without the Briscoes. It's no conversation. And we already know how I feel about Mercedes. Who did I miss? Anybody? Was there anybody else?
I think you nailed it. Lyric, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for so much being on the ballot. It was very. I think I said it before during the podcast. I don't quite remember it. I'm going to say it again anyways. It was very important for me to get you on the show. In a lot of ways, to go with the conversation. I really wanted to get you on the show because, as you've stated with the Wrestling Observer voters, there's been a lot of white men on the show, and it was very important for me to get other voices in this show. And it felt like with Mercedes Mone, it felt like all the more appropriate. So thank you for being the Mercedes Mone of the Ballot podcast, and sort of starting that trend here. Not necessarily trend, I guess, but starting, and hopefully I can get more voices, because I think you're right. I think you're one of the more, I think you're one of the more prominent female voices in this wrestling space, and I think that is just a issue of more women being into it. But obviously, you were inspired by Mercedes Mone, and hopefully, more women will be inspired by you and others, and maybe one day we'll have a whole lot more women voices in this whole wrestling sphere.
Let's hope.
Let's hope. And I want people to note she did flick her hair back in a very cool fashion that really cemented that let's hope. And I really appreciated it. Lyric, thank you so much. I want to give you the floor to end this. Of course, I'll let you do the classic podcastism of plugs at the very end of a podcast, but also if you have any closing thoughts, closing statements to really sum up your thoughts on Mercedes Mone, you can obviously have those now.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to reiterate about Mercedes. I know when she calls herself and when people call her the Beyonce of wrestling, people always assume like, oh, it's about like the glitz and the glam and the fashion. There's a reason why people call her the Beyonce. And I'll tell you exactly why. Beyonce is not just a great singer. Beyonce is not just a great dancer. Beyonce is not just a great performer. Beyonce, as a package, over the course of her career, has achieved every milestone that exists, between the Grammys. And like I look at honestly, Grammys is kind of like championships, right? And so you have like those physical goals. Then you'll have like the cultural significance of it all, of being able to travel to all these different countries and sell out shows and stores and things. And this is another thing of Beyonce, especially in this phase of her career. Her and Mercedes are in very similar phases of their career, right? Of kind of, there was a time in Beyonce's career where she like basically changed her manager, who was her dad. She left her record label. She started her own label. So starting from, I think, Lemonade on, that's all like her self-produced stuff. She's fully in control of her career. Even like her tour right now, the sponsors of her tour are her own businesses. Mercedes, if you haven't caught on, is very much so in that same time in her career, right? Really in control of what she's doing. Really, she chooses where she wrestles. She chooses, she wants to have her hand. She doesn't want to be limited. And she's really building an empire, for herself.
Yeah.
And in doing so, guess what? Does Beyonce, is she always number one on streaming? No. Like, is she doing the type of numbers like, on social media, the other artists are promoting the same? No. But do you know why she doesn't do it? Because she doesn't have to. She's already proven herself in those regards, What she's doing now is she is creating the music that she wants to make. And music that pushes culture, that makes us think. Think about how many stores you're seeing right now with rodeo collections, because of Cowboy Carter, and the same thing happened with Renaissance, like of how many the silver was sold out.
Mm-hmm.
But that's when you trade in numbers and that for cultural significance, everything hits different. And Mercedes is exactly the same, like exactly the same when it comes to professional wrestling. Matches that stick with you, matches that make people think and rewatch and analyze, even if they hadn't done so before. And also too, think about the people she's pulled up. How many Black country artists were platformed? Look at Shabuzi, right? And all these people who have directly benefited from Beyonce shedding a light, using her extremely large platform to shed a light on the people who have been in this space doing the work. Who does that sound like? Sounds like Mercedes Mone being able to put a platform on women's wrestling all over the world. And I said, let's say you can get away with not having the streams and the numbers that other people have because Beyonce has built up a core audience that is willing to follow her wherever she goes. She announces a tour, it sells out like that. Who does that sound like? It sounds like Mercedes Mone, who's built up this core audience, who is willing to support her, whether it's WWE, AEW, New Japan, Stardom, Rev Pro, CMLL soon. There's so many different, there's so many similarities there and commonalities that go beyond just pretty outfits and glitz and glamour. And that's what I really, really want people to really take from the Beyonce of wrestling thing of it's conquering all of the achievements on the checklist, right? That people have for the greats. And then deciding to push the culture for it and do your own thing, and create. And so that's why I've always been personally inspired by both of these people, my goats, truly. So that's it. Thank you for having me. I feel like I really just I was talking a lot.
No worries.
You can find me at Lyric Wrestling on Twitter and Instagram, and you can subscribe to my YouTube at Lyric Swinton. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate this. And I look forward to everybody hearing it. And yeah, if you do have any voting power, you know who I think you should vote for. So,
well, I appreciate it so much. And of course, I appreciate the Beyonce, Mercedes Moné connection. And I imagine going along with the rest of your Mount Rushmore, I can't wait for the Kenny Omega, Audrey McDonald article that you'll write later. Lyric, thank you so much for coming onto the ballot. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this month's episode of The Ballot. We'll be back next month for an all-new episode talking about an all-new case, about an all-new group of wrestlers. That's a little teaser because I said the word group. All right, until next month, we'll see you all later. Goodbye, everybody. This has been a Count Out Podcast.
Hello, my name is Jessica and I'm the host of Jumping Knee Pod, a modern day All Japan podcast. Join me and a guest each month as we cover all that went down in the ring, outside of the ring and everywhere else. Big title matches, tournaments, character arcs, storytelling, feuds and more. It's all covered on Jumping Knee Pod. Look out for a bonus episode every once in a while covering a variety of All Japan topics. So make sure you tune into Jumping Knee Pod. It's a new All Japan podcast for a new All Japan era.